So last class we talked about the process of chemical evolution and how it is thought to have given rise to the first pool of cells. And once you have a pool of cells, then biological evolution kicks in. So in this lecture, which will be 3 parts, I want to talk about what evolution is, what biological evolution is. I'm going to give you the example of finches from the Galapagos Island and some studies in them that show these the principle and concepts of evolution. And then we'll look at some other examples that are relevant or hopefully at least interesting to all of us, some of which involve microbiology. In 1859, Charles Darwin, a British naturalist, published a very famous book called On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. In that book, Darwin introduced the idea that populations of organisms evolve or change over time by means of natural selection. In this book, Darwin presented evidence, much of which was gathered while he was on board the ship the Beagle during the 1830s on an expedition aimed at discovery, that supported the fact that the diversity of life on Earth today arose by common descent from a common ancestor through biological evolution. Needless to say, this was a controversial idea at the time, and for some today it still is. Here let's consider the definition of evolution to be genetic change in a population over time. We're going to focus on the mechanism of natural selection, which is one of the main mechanisms of evolution, but I want to note that there are actually other mechanisms that are important in the evolutionary process. Evolution, biological evolution, can happen if 3 conditions are met in populations. Let's consider those now. So the first condition that has to be met in order for biological evolution to occur is that individuals within a population have to be variable. That means that they have to have different traits, and different traits means having different genes. Okay? Either altogether different genes or genes that are similar but have slight variation in DNA sequence, allowing for slight or maybe even significant changes at the protein level. Remember that proteins ultimately control traits. And remember that genes control proteins. So you have to have genetic differences in order to have protein differences, in order to have trait differences. Within a population of the same organism, it's quite typical to always have diversity or variability. Essentially, item 2 is restating what I just said, and that is that at least some of this variation, and that being variation in traits, has to be heritable. Okay? To be heritable, it has to be genetic. In other words, it has to be something that you can pass on from parent to offspring. In other words, genes. Finally, the third condition that must be met in order to have biological evolution is that there has to be some sort of consistent relationship between a trait of interest and some measure of survival or reproduction. Here we see that we have a bird and it's acting as a predator. Our little critters on the screen to the left are perhaps all insects within a population, same type of insects, and the bird is predating or eating the little red ones. So perhaps the bird is able to see them better against the background environment that they are found in. Perhaps they're not as well camouflaged. And so the trait of coloration in this case is directly correlated with survival. And if you don't survive, you can't reproduce. So we can also say that the trait of coloration is directly related to reproduction. The result of this is natural selection, or actually I should just say that all of this is about natural selection. So here we see that traits that confer increased fitness, and let's define fitness as survival and reproduction. Those traits that confer increased fitness will increase in frequency in the population. So the green insects are surviving the predation pressure. We refer to that as pressure, selective pressure in this case, and they are able then to reproduce. And so over time, and that's what this arrow is showing. We see a shift in population. So the frequency of red insects is declining over generations or time. And that is showing us natural selection against the red insects and for the green insects. That's natural selection. That is evolution, which is happening at the population level. And essentially, those are the ideas that Darwin proposed and that we have gathered, decades and decades worth of data to support. That's really all there is to it. It's a very simple idea, but it's very powerful in that it explains the incredible diversity of life on Earth today and how it came to be. Let's move on to the next part of this lecture now.